Today on the live stream. Welcome to Committee Kaupapa Taiao, the Climate Change and Sustainability Committee meeting of May the 2nd. Before we go on to our opening karakia, if everyone please note the emergency procedures, and I ask that your phones are turned to silent or off for the duration of the meeting. Judy will now put the opening karakia on the screens for everyone to see. Please feel free to join in. Me noi tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. Second on the agenda, we've got apologies from Councillor Shaw for non-attendance today. Do we have any other apologies? No. I move the apologies. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Parkin. All in favour say aye. I declare that carried. We have no public comment today. So moving on to item 4, conflicts of interest. Do any members have a conflict to declare? No, thank you. So now we're going to move on to item 5. Our first report today with recommendations to note is the Community Engagement Fund and Local Projects Fund options on page 8. So I'll pass over to Andrea in a moment. She's going to also touch on a few points that I've discussed with her beforehand, and also addressing a question that's come in today from elected members. Andrea.
Thank you, Chair. So at the March meeting of the Annual Plan LTP Subcommittee, elected members agreed to change the way that both the Local Projects Fund and the Community Engagement Fund are distributed in this triennium, and also to a 50% reduction in the Local Projects Fund, but with that money continuing to be ring-fenced for the wards that it was intended for. So officers were asked to prepare a report for this committee and to explore how the funding could be more closely aligned to Council's carbon reduction goals. So we were asked to work with the chair of the committee in doing that, and so we've done that. The recommendation that we're putting forward today is one that's come after quite a bit of consideration, both of the way we've previously distributed and how other funds are distributed within council. Also looking at, for this amount of money, what's an appropriate mechanism for the distribution. So making sure that the way that we are distributing the money, given the amount of money there is, doesn't create an unreasonable expectation from people applying. There shouldn't be too many hurdles. It's not a big amount of money, and doesn't create a significant workload for council to distribute the money. So what we're suggesting is that the funds come together under one banner, but remaining as 2 separate funding streams. And they would be a contestable fund for both community engagement and climate change initiatives, with the amounts of money that currently sit in the 2 different funds staying under those particular streams of funding. The funding would be in line with the existing determinations of what is available for each ward in each of those funds. So the amounts of money going and the places that it would go doesn't change, but it would be looked at both one lot for community engagement with some recognition of carbon reduction, and in the other one at climate change initiatives. We've gone to a high level detail in the paper because we wanted to get some feedback before we go into further designing and detail what this might look like, but hopefully there's enough information there for you to have a discussion around whether this direction is going to deliver on what council was seeking from this. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Just before any questions, can you just touch on the response from Jenny around the change from CapEx to OPEX funding?
Yeah, sure. There was a question on what the impact on rates might be from this decision, given that funding is shifting from CapEx, because it was an assets fund, to OPEX funding, and that they are funded in different ways. So OPEX funding generally has an impact on rates, but we're not proposing to suggest any additional rates increase through this switch. The money will be offset through other projects in this year's work plan. So the OPEX that's involved here doesn't require any additional rates funding.
Thank you, Andrea. Any questions from members? Councillor Edwards.
So thank you very much for that last clarification, because that was definitely one of the questions from me. But just following on from that, paragraph 21, it says, because the contestable fund does not create any assets from the perspective of Hutt City Council. But one of the examples given is, bike storage, secure bike storage facilities, and there may well be other projects, good projects, that do create assets, that do need, maintenance long-term and so on. How are we going to handle that?
Well, the intention is that these are community-owned assets. So, and much like in the last round of, in the last training, how some of the, I think one of the panels at least distributed their money, was that it would go to assets that were owned by the community. And one of the challenges around the panels work has been having the resource to deliver on the projects that have come out through the panels. And as you know, we've got a backlog of panels projects waiting to be delivered due to other competing demands for that resource. So the idea here was that these assets would be owned by community, and it might be schools and it might be other community organisations with land and with facilities. And so we could support the creation of assets for them that they would then own the assets.
Further questions? Councillor Mitchell.
Just to follow up on that for clarity. So there was an issue in previous trinium that council didn't have the capacity to deliver on an asset. Say it was a fancy bike park or something like that. And under this new model, council wouldn't have any involvement in the delivery. A community group would have to commission and have that installed and belong to the community.
Council would have some involvement, but not the same level of involvement that we've had previously. So certainly around where we need to be involved around advice and help, but council teams wouldn't be delivering the projects in the same way that they did for panels.
Sorry, I did have a couple of other questions about other things. And in your introduction, you talked about the remaining two funding streams, and I was a bit confused because I'd read the paper as it being combined into one. So can I just clarify, the Community Engagement Fund will stay a Community Engagement Fund but have a climate focus, and that will be across all of the city. And the Local Projects Fund will become a Climate Initiatives Fund, but with the money ring-fenced for where it previously sat. So that's in the wards that don't have a community board. Is that correct?
So the Engagement Fund would also continue to be ring-fenced in each area, and where there are community boards, it would be distributed by the community boards. I think the bringing together of the two funding streams is more around the mechanism for delivering it, so that we can go out and advertise once for ideas and bring them into one pool of thinking and one pool of decision making, rather than having two separate processes for some things where there are similarities. So they are still two quite distinct funding streams with those specific outcomes, but under one kind of mechanism of asking for applications and making decisions.
And that makes sense, but what that means though is that where there is a community board, they don't have this this climate initiative fund, the second fund, they don't have access to that fund, right? They only have a community engagement.
Correct.
Deputy Mayor Lewis, did you have a question? And then Councillor Edwards.
I was just wondering with the that you said, community could apply for it and it would be the asset of the community. That means it's in a public space, or is it, how much of the community do we rate to have that involvement in the project? How do you ascertain that and weigh it up?
That's probably something that you'd look at in the criteria around who would benefit from it. And just like the panel's decision making, you'd be looking for broad community benefit. So you wouldn't be looking for things that were provided to exclusively.
Councillor Edwards, then Councillor Brown.
I'm struggling for a better word than cross-contamination, but can there be, if there's a really cool climate change related project that a ward wants to do, can funds from the community, in the other part of the fund be used, or are those two funds really quite separate and this fund must be used for community engagement type stuff and this fund for...
I think previously the decision-making, both on the engagement fund and on the local projects fund, there's been quite a bit of scope taken by the people making the decisions, with that sense that as long as it's aligning to the outcomes, then there is room for that. And I think within this would be our first time of doing it this way, and there'd probably be a little bit of learning around what kind of applications we got and whether we get the right kind and whether they're in the right funding, etc. But I think you'd want there to be that leeway with a really strong focus on the outcomes.
Councillor Brown.
I think that might have answered it, but I was going to ask, how will you manage when people are applying for funding? They'll find a workaround. So it could be community funding just retrofitted with some climate change outcome measures to fit the fund, or are you going to put some structure around that?
I think the criteria will be the key there, and we've not yet at the stage of developing the criteria, but I think you'd expect to see for the engagement fund that it's some activity that may previously have been funded under that fund and maybe some new activity, but with a clear change around carbon reduction or clear efforts around carbon reduction. With the other one, the criteria will be much more around carbon reduction as the objective, not engagement. So I think the criteria will be quite different, but that doesn't mean there might not be some things that kind of come into both.
Councillor Mitchell.
I did just have one other question, and it's about the financial tables on page 12, which show this to be just a one-off change for the triennium, but I assume it's an ongoing proposition.
Actually, Jenny's with us. She'll be able to tell us about the financial side of that.
Yes, excuse me. Yeah, so basically the decision is about just changing the 23-24 budget, so for this triennium. And what the report says is that through the next LTP process, we'll review the longer term implications. So we haven't adjusted any of the budgets from 26-27 onwards.
And I'll also add, obviously at the end of this triennium, we'll have a clear idea of representation reviews outcomes. And so that will give some clear guidance to the incoming council around what the status is of representation across our city, and therefore be able to deal with some of the inequity issues and challenges that we currently sit within. Any final questions from members? No. In that case, I will move the recommendations on page 8, numbered 1 to 6. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Parkin. Is there any debate? Councillor Edwards?
Yeah, I think this is a good step forward and a way of funding some things that could help with what is possibly the greatest challenge in front of the city, climate change. I do worry that we're being a little bit unrealistic on the idea that any assets created, community groups are responsible for their ongoing care and repair and all the other things that happen. And when I think back to some of the projects that the Western Ward panel was looking at in the last triennium, the bike park, okay, that'll be looked after by the school, but we were going to do some track maintenance and signs with the remainder of the money. Now that was not going to be a community responsibility to look after going forward. That was council. So I'm hoping there might be some flexibility there, with just a dose of realism. But yeah, overall, I'm very much in favour of this.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor Lawes.
Thank you. Yeah, I read the report first and I thought, there will be communities missing out. A lot of them have used it for events and everything to, the engagement fund. But then I thought, well, no, the event could go ahead as long as there was a focus on the better outcomes for the climate. So yes, I agree, it's a good move.
Deputy Mayor, Councillor Mitchell.
Yeah, I think I sit in a similar place to my colleagues. I think this is a really great first step forward, and this is actually something we've been calling for a while, for this kind of funding to be available to our community. And I kind of sit a little bit uneasily too with where the funding came from and what we've lost by reapportioning that funding. We heard at that meeting in February from those panels how the relationships with council were really important to those communities and the money for the funding of assets. So they're getting a reduced amount of money and a reduced amount of representation as well through this. However, you know, it is a good step forward, and I'm glad to hear it'll be a long-term plan conversation as well, because I feel a bit uneasy now that some of our communities will have access to more funding for climate action than other communities, and really, you know, it should be the same across our whole city. So we haven't had a conversation with our community about how we fund climate action and how much we fund climate action. I think that is a long-term plan proposition there, but, you know, this is a start, and hopefully some good things will happen over the next year or so to kind of show us a way as well. So thank you.
Councillor, any other comment? Councillor Parkin.
Kia ora. Obviously, as seconding the motion, I support it. I agree with Councillor Mitchell in terms of the representation challenges and the potential losses that we have. But I would say that we have the representation review, and I will be encouraging my community to make sure that they submit on that representation review. And if the community chooses to want a tier 2 level of representation, then that's something that we need to hear from the community. And yeah, I can live with the change, and definitely see that we need to make the changes so that climate change becomes much more part of our general thinking. And I think this is a step to allow the community to engage with the issue and start thinking creatively about what can be done to reduce our climate carbon reduction and our impact on the climate, and also to a later extent to our resilience.
Councillor. Mayor Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say and reiterate Councillor Mitchell's point. I think that you're alluding to around this being a bit of a journey. The long-term plan is certainly going to be the key time for us to really embed climate change initiatives and funding and investment through that process. And that's not going to be an easy conversation when we think about all of the competing priorities that we're going to have to contend with. But I do see this as a bit of a step change and a signal to our community around trying to ensure that the impact on the climate is front of mind when we are thinking about our events, when we are thinking about our investment and how we go about things. And I think that's already happening from a lot of funders in the Wellington region and across New Zealand. I'm part of the Hutt Charitable Trust, and I know that that's something which is already top of mind for us. And you can see that those community groups and organisations do adapt when you make that criteria and expectations clear, and it gets them thinking in a different space as well, which is a positive thing. So certainly not perfect, but I think this will get us through and head us in the right direction over the next 12 months while we have that bigger conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My comments around this is, again, it has been a while coming to get some funding for grassroots initiatives in our communities to have their actions against climate realised. And one of the things that came up time and time again during the engagement process was the lack of small pots of funding to be applied for to get those actions off the ground. So for me, these funds will enable some of the actions to occur. And as you've clearly said as well, Mr. Mayor, our existing community engagement partners will be able to continue to do their activities. But what this will enable them to do is to have a really intentional step towards mitigating their waste, making sure that all of their actions as well are actually having a more positive effect on the environment. And actually, we know all these engagement events have huge participation numbers. So residents will be coming to these events, being socialised into these new ways of doing things, which will then help raise the profile of climate change action in our communities. I do agree there is a further conversation to be had around the communities, particularly in the Harbour Ward and Wainui and Mata, that don't have access to the wider funding, to make sure that in time we can have everyone in our city able to apply to a similar fund. Again, just want to thank the officers, Andrea and Jenny as well, for your contributions today. I think that this is a good landing point, and I know that Andrea has been taking notes as well of some of the concerns and points raised as well, which no doubt will be implemented and considered as part of the more detailed criteria. So with that being said, I'm going to now put the motions 1 to 6. All in favour say aye. Aye. I declare that carried. So now welcome up Ewan and your team to the table. We're now on page 13, the report back on curbside collection, 1-year implementation review. And so please take the report mostly as read. If there's any high-level comments you wish to add or anything that's come in since you wrote the report, then please do so.
Thank you for that. Now, before I get into the report, I just wanted to briefly introduce Jeff Roberts. He's the new manager of waste minimisation. So he's taking over from Dill, who left us for the competition in Wellington City. And so I'm looking forward to handing over some of the work streams. So do expect to see him in the coming committee cycles. Now, looking at the report in front of you, yes, I do assume you've read it, but just a very brief summary. So this is the report back on the 1-year implementation review. As Council approved, has previously said that you would like us to review the service 1 year after the implementation. And we did engage an external consultant to help us with that work. And overall, I would say it's very pleasing with some of the results are really pleasing in terms of the survey results from residents. It's fair to say that if we had run the survey last year, it probably wouldn't be as positive, but it's given us some time to embed the service, and especially the implementation of our new ticketing system in the last 3 months has really resulted in another step change in terms of reducing the churn and getting back to residents in a very timely fashion. So overall, I'm happy to take any questions on the report.
Thank you, Ewan. Questions from members? Councillor Mitchell, then Deputy Mayor Lawes.
Kia ora. One of the sticky issues in there seems to be these muds, and some of them needing a lot more service than clearly was anticipated or than anyone else gets. And I know the kind of pay-as-you-throw model was kind of ruled out for the general service, but I wonder if with these muds, if they're literally producing more rubbish than they can hold and requiring extra collections, if there's a way that they could just be charged directly for the amount of waste that's being removed or the number of visits.
So with the multi-unit dwellings, one feature that's currently part of the system is that they are being charged a fee equivalent to the 80-litre bin. And the reason why we made that decision during the rollout was that we assumed that when people live in apartments, they tend to be smaller apartments or not as big as a large house. They might have fewer people living in them, and therefore they might produce less waste overall. What we found, though, is that there's quite a big spread in terms of the multi-unit dwellings. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that some of them haven't got recycling yet for various reasons. So there are some multi-unit dwellings that have very large, 3 cubic metre large refuse bins, and we have had recycling at those locations, and we have had to pull them back because of severe contamination. So the refuse volume will have to be higher to cater for the lack of recycling receptacles at those locations. But overall as well, it's fair to say that given the spread, it probably would have been more appropriate to select the 120 litre equivalent, which is the average for the city for those multi-unit dwellings. And that actually would align the charges, more with the costs that we incur. So to come back to your question in terms of the pay-as-you-throw, I don't think pay-as-you-throw would be appropriate at all for multi-unit dwellings because the collection is very regular. It's not like you have a bin and you only empty it when it's full. It's actually, you have got 20 apartments and there is always some waste. So you can pretty much plan for at reasonably high confidence level, how often you have to go in and empty those bins. I think it's more of a challenge around aligning bin capacity with what needs to be there and also sorting out the recycling challenges. And we do have a project underway to align our messages more for multi-unit dwelling residents in terms of the guides they get for recycling and some of the signage that will be in place for those shared communal spaces, because a lot of the educational material we have is very much geared towards your standalone house, whereas those 43 properties is quite a small share of the cities of the city at the moment.
Further question, Deputy Mayor, and then Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. Thanks for the very thorough report, Yoon. Page 15 under H is talking about reduction in frequency for refuse rubbish users. Is there an opportunity, I don't know if anyone's doing it, to volunteer a reduction in service for a household? I mean, if they're not needed?
Well, you can already do that. So when you have a bin at your house, the fact that you might have a 120 litre bin is not a target, so you don't have to fill it up. And in fact, in my house, I only put it out probably every 2 weeks. So that is one way to manage this. And of course, it does provide some resilience. If there is an issue with the service, it could be an emergency, it could be a flood event, or it could be an earthquake, where maybe the service can't run for a week. So that actually provides some resilience to those households as well. In terms of reducing the cost, which I think is, are you asking also about the cost of the service if it was fortnightly? Okay.
And the next page, I just noted that the report back from, it's a positive here, not question really, the improvement opportunities were very good. So,
yes, and we've started working on those already. So some of those are already in train.
Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. Firstly, I just want to say this is such an excellent report, absolutely full of useful information and so on. But I just wonder if we're at risk of underestimating the number of people who are, just looking at this term, low waste households, 4%. I'm looking at the top of page 26. And we're relying on our survey data, which showed that only that very small number of people with the small 80 litre bins are putting it out fortnightly. And I'm just wondering, actually, I think there might be quite a few people with 80 litre bins that only fill up a little bit of it, but put it out because they just don't want the smell of food around or whatever for that extra time. I'm one of them. And I think it might be quite common. Absolutely agree with the conclusions that the report reaches, that until we have a food collection service and some of these other things fall into place, what's being recommended is the right way to go. But I do wonder if we're underestimating the number of our households who are in this category.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, another thing that's not considered is that some people have a 120 litre bin and they might also only put it out every 2 months. I guess the challenge we've got here is we don't have data on how full the bins are. So we can only go by how often they put it out based on the survey methodology. So that was kind of a proxy, but I do acknowledge that there are limitations with the data and we don't really have a good understanding unless we actually measure how much waste is in the bin and how often do they actually put it out in reality.
Councillor Pucken.
Through you, Chair. Just wondering whether or not we could estimate that based on the number of uplifts of bins, the size of bins that we've got and the time that it takes to fill up one of the rubbish trucks. We know the volume of a rubbish truck, so would we be able to do that calculation just as a back of the napkin maths?
I would say no, because the trucks do empty not just the 80 litre bins, but the 120 and the 240. So you'd end up with an average. So you can probably, we can measure the amount of waste that is in a truck, and the data will be available somewhere. It's just a matter of analysing it. But then you would not know unless you dive into each route how many of those households then have 80 versus 120. So you get an average for everything. It's probably a lot of work for reasonably little gain.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, so just on that, if we had only two options of best bang for buck of reducing the amount of recycling to the landfill, and it was a very back to basics, would you put your finger on education of residents? Like if we were to make the biggest impact with the one measure, like we're coming up with a whole lot of little things, but is it education of people? Because we've still got a high contamination of recycling. 20% is not a huge reduction in the landfill.
No, but let's not forget that the landfill isn't just a facility that takes Lower Hutt and Upper Hutt waste. So it is also a regional facility, and we do take some household waste from the Wairarapa. We do take waste from Kapiti in terms of the biosolids. So the disposal reduction to landfills will have is a bigger task than just looking at things like the curbside service, which might make up 20 to 30% of waste that is disposed at landfills. So for the curbside, I would say, yes, we do need to invest more in education because contamination is a problem. But the next step is, and I think it's alluded to in the paper, is how do we encourage a diversion of things like food organics and green organics? And there's that separate piece around the business case. And I think that would be quite a significant step change in terms of diverting material. Have I?
Just a follow-up question, but as you say, that's only within the remit of Lower Hutt, since others are using it.
That's correct. So it's interesting that the government has noted its intention or its expectation that all urban councils will have some sort of food organics collection by 2030. So that would suggest that our neighbours in Upper Hutt might have to look at their work program in terms of what that means for them. And then obviously if that happens, then that will have a flow-on effect in terms of the landfill as well. But that's still within the confines of the curbside service. So the diversion of C&D, so construction demolition waste, is actually quite a very significant waste source. So having infrastructure in place for that will then enable a reduction of waste in that space. So potentially that new facility in Manor Park that Waste Management is talking about and has applied for consent for may well have an impact on or a flow-through effect from probably 2026 onwards.
Thank you. Any final questions? No? Judy's now going to put on screen the recommendations. It's only a minor change, but we're having a new one as our recommendation. And the primary reason for that is to ensure that when this paper goes to full council, that all of the appendixes are also provided to all members of council as well. So I'll read it out, which is 1, notes and receives the officer's report and its appendixes attached as Appendix A. That's the only change. So I'm going to move the recommendations now 1 to 10. Councillor Edwards for the second. Is there any debate? Mayor Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, can I just say how pleased I was with this report and the information that it provided us, and I think the real insight into how this service has operated since it was launched in July 2021. Is that right? Yes. Shouldn't forget the date. Remember it well. But I just wanted to highlight some of the numbers, the stats in that report. First being, of course, as mentioned, a 20% increase in recycling, which is really good news, but of course we want to see that go up even more. 90% reduction in emissions once the fleet is fully electrified. That is a pretty outstanding stat once we're able to get to that particular point. 1,657 people who were surveyed with an 88% overall satisfaction rate. Given how the councillors who are around the table will remember the discussions at the time and the feeling in the community, I think that's a pretty outstanding outcome. And I know that I can go for a few months now before anyone even raises rubbish and recycling with me, which certainly wasn't the case 18 months ago. And also we did have an 82% satisfaction on the communications of how their service is operating and how we engage our residents as well. And I know that there were some challenges when we were being particularly overloaded there. But I just also wanted to highlight the particular advantages now as we face what is a cost of living crisis in our communities and with our families. And this was a big driver for us making the decision that we made at the time. And I'm really grateful that we did, given the costs that many people were facing. So if you look at the average over the region, we are 50% lower in cost for 80 litre and 120 litre bins, and 35% lower than a 240 litre bin. That does make a huge difference for the average household. And I suspect that if we had our non-rates funded system, we would have seen a significant increase, and we would see a significant increase in dumping. And all of those realities when families have to decide what they're going to spend their budget on and what they prioritise. Some really other great stats, and I know this was highlighted by the team. And I remember you talking a lot about health and safety and rubbish bags, and there was some strong views that maybe we should keep rubbish bags during the debate. But clearly there has been a significant drop-off in workplace injuries, and that is with, of course, a significant increase in our role in actually collecting rubbish and recycling. That is outstanding for our workers out there doing the job day in, day out in our communities. And finally, I just wanted to say that, we did give the clear commitment that we would consider pay as you throw in this 12 monthly review to our community when we made the decision to go for a rates funded bin service. And I can see that in here there is a really good analysis of that, but also a number of other options. And quite clearly, I think now is not the time to make any significant changes with the system, given that I think it is clearly operating in a good way. But of course, there are going to be continued opportunities to improve the service and continue our mission on waste minimisation. And I think there's some good, reasonable suggestions in the paper that we can work with without having to bring in something like a pay-as-you-throw, particularly when councils like Auckland have moved away from it as well. So really just wanted to highlight those stats in the paper and thank everyone for their efforts. And of course, our residents out there who day in, day out, ensuring that they particularly follow our guidelines around recycling and rubbish and glass and working with that new system as well, and all of the positive feedback that I certainly get now on the system.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think you've summed it up really well, including the scorecard of performance and the satisfaction in our city. Any other comments before we put it to the vote? No. Again, as the Mayor said, on behalf of the committee, thank you very much to all the officers over the rollout and taking the time to do a fantastic report, as noted in the draft agenda, Ewan. You can be really proud of the work that you and your team have done. So I'm going to put the motion. All in favour say aye. I declare that carried. Andrew, come up to the table now as well. We're now moving on to page 167 for the development of Council's new waste management and minimisation plan and update on other solid waste and waste minimisation work. Please take your report as read, but if there's anything that you want to go over quickly, feel free to do so now before we open for questions.
Thank you, Chair. Kia ora koutou. There's only two updates I have to the report. First of all, the stakeholder engagement, as mentioned, for the local action plans has now been undertaken. And the May the 10th briefing is now being rescheduled for a date in June, yet to be confirmed.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other questions from members? Councillor Edwards.
Just disappointing to see that the contamination rate sort of surged again in March. Paragraph 26. How many bins, if any, have we now seized after they had three warnings?
So the latest number I have was that 70 bins have now been removed. I can talk a little bit more about what happened in March, if that would.
Please do so.
Okay. So we became aware of a contamination outbreak, if you will, in one or two suburbs in Lower Hutt. So that the contamination was such that if OG were aware, that they would have diverted those trucks straight to landfill. However, that's how serious it was. But just like to say that we've identified the routes that were involved, and we've now developed some collateral in which we will be issuing very shortly to households along that route, just reminding them about sort of the ins and outs of recycling and the bin removal scheme as well.
If I just follow up on this as well, is that, so with our bin inspections, we're carrying out about 6,000 to 7,000 per month. So that means that since November, we've covered more than half the city. So we did obviously do bin inspections before that, but the numbers have gone up significantly since November and since we rolled out the 3 strikes approach. And I guess we're now at a point where we will have actually covered most of the city at one point or another. So we actually now do understand where some of the hotspots are. Whereas when we started this, you might literally miss whole suburbs or whole areas. We now know where they are, so we can target this much more than we initially were able to.
That's right. So we're building up a bigger picture of what's happening out there. And I certainly hope that this was just a one-off. And so, yeah, we will still continue to see that downward trend.
Any further questions, Councillor Edwards, or does that cover it off for you? We've got Councillor Brown and then Councillor Mitchell.
Been away too long. So is it, when you say an outbreak, what do you mean by an outbreak?
For want of a better term, we received notification from OG that they had noticed a significant spike in contamination along this particular route, well above what would be expected.
Where is it?
So the route predominantly is in Nainai, and that's where we have focused our attention is towards Nainai and the other sort of suburbs involved.
And just following on from that, as well as your attention, is there an escalation in education and campaign targeted around that route as well?
So we're doing a pamphlet drop to those addresses along the route, which is sort of explaining the recycling process in more detail. So that is part of the education campaign. And as Ewan mentioned, our bin inspectors are out there who also educate residents firsthand. And of course, we've got our sort of overall behaviour change campaign still running in the background.
So just and coming back to the 3 strikes approach that we are still following. So ultimately, any properties that do get a red sticker, they are then prioritised and they go on what we call the revisit list. And so that means that there's a follow-through process. And while there may well be a household that's, didn't do it right, if they keep doing that, then obviously they would be affected by our 3 strikes approach. So I'm not saying that we've got all the levers, we can pull all the levers to manage the problem, but we've got a few in play to help with that.
Thank you for that clarity. We're going to go to Councillor Mitchell, then Councillor Parkin.
I've got a couple of questions, but I'll just stick on the topic with one for now, which was about, I don't know how much interaction our officers have with these residents as they implement the 3 strikes rule. But I'm kind of curious if you have any read over the last year of whether this is an education problem, whether these people don't know, or whether they just don't care and, aren't going to use the system properly.
Well, we don't have any good data on it in terms of in terms of survey data, other than the analysis that we did when we designed the campaign, and that at the time you will recall we briefed you on it. It's both. So there is a lack of education on what can and can't be recycled, and I mean I do get that in my own household. So if my household can't get it right, I'm sure that other can't. They're struggling too. But there is also an element of don't care somewhere in the mix, and that's quite tricky to address, as we know. And our campaign focused on the addressing those myths, the things that you think you can do, but actually you can't. But it's perhaps less effective in actually addressing the, if you just don't care, then, no nice advertisement will fix that. And so that's where kind of the 3 strikes policy comes into play.
And hopefully that policy will have an effect on this breakout. What did you call it, a breakout? Because presumably not all those people forgot how to recycle properly all of a sudden, right? They've, for some reason, just decided not to.
One thing to keep in mind, Councillor Mitchell, is also we do have flux in the city in the sense that, houses get sold, people move into a new property. So when we say we educate or we do education work, it's not like you can do it once and then you never have to do it again. It's actually a continuous piece of work that we just need to keep going because of that, people changing, moving places.
Thank you. Yeah, Councillor Parkin, Councillor Edwards, and then Deputy Mayor Lewis.
Through your chair. Just wondering, is there a correlation between the level of recycling contamination and whether or not people are having full bins, full rubbish bins? And if so, have we actually looked at that? Do we have that data? And I'm assuming that if we do have full rubbish bins, then there's an underlying economic factor that may be at play here as well.
So I can answer that. So we don't have data on how full a bin is when it's collected by the truck. However, as I mentioned before, that the collateral that's going out to these addresses, we do actually mention that to people, look, if your recycling bin is too small, and hence sort of the residual waste if their rubbish bin is too small and their waste is going into the recycling bin, then they can contact the council and we can upsize their bin. So we have identified that as a potential factor in this sort of rise in contamination. So we're hoping that will have an impact.
There's some limited data through the survey that we did, where there are some instances where someone has a 120 litre recycling bin and then basically states, well, I don't have enough recycling capacity. I guess the issue is that someone in that household, either that person or the previous owner or the property owner, would have selected a smaller recycling bin. And you may recall in the rollout, there was a little bit of feedback of, I don't need a 240. Why am I getting this big bin? I'm choosing the smaller one. Chances are there will be people out there that are now actually, they probably should have the big one, but they opted for a smaller one. So there will be some of that at play as well. But we don't really have any good quantitative data to get down to the bottom of that.
Follow up. I'm wondering whether or not when you've got people doing that second check, whether or not it would be worth actually getting them to check not just the recycling bin, but if the rubbish bins haven't been emptied, check whether or not the rubbish bin is at full capacity, and that would actually give us a steer on whether or not it's an economic factor as to whether or not they need to have that rubbish bin upsized.
We can certainly look into that. It'll be a matter of scheduling, because I know that the recycling trucks come at different times to the rubbish trucks. So we can certainly look into it.
Thank you. We've got Councillor Edwards, Deputy Mayor Lewis, then Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think I'm along the same lines as Councillor Parkin, and impossible for you guys to tell, but I do note from the previous report and the survey results, that there are quite a few people who rent who are saying that their landlord has opted for the small bin to save money. And I guess from their point of view, they must think it must be very tempting once their too small rubbish bin is full to look at the other big bin with the yellow lid and think, can I get away with that? But I've got no idea what we could do about that or how common it is.
I mean, this is where a more targeted approach comes into play. And the 3 strikes policy is one way. Another one is just when we identify those properties, that we provide some advice and possibly try to work with the property owner and say, look, actually there are bigger bin options, and it's not serving the renter either if they get the recycling bin taken away and then there is waste accumulating. So no one wins. So there's a bit of education work fitting into that in a more targeted way.
Deputy Mayor Loss? Oh,
Sorry.
sorry, Councillor, is it important?
Do we still offer an option once a year where you can upgrade to a bigger bin because you realise, you know, that you're undersized? Is that a way of tackling this problem, especially if it was, you know, for landlords?
As you will be aware, between April and June, it's actually free to change. So there is no cost in changing, even upsizing. So
is it worth publicising? Because I'm a councillor, and I'm not aware of, I wasn't aware of that.
It's a delicate balance between advertising it too much and then getting a large influx of changes and then people changing back.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Loss?
Thank you. I'm sure we've all got lots of ideas when we have this conversation. But going back to the problem area you mentioned, do we know if English is a second language in that area for reading and things like that?
From a previous life, I know that language can be a big barrier to the suburb or these suburbs. So we are in the process of getting our website, the bin removal part of it, translated into a number of different languages. And we're also working on getting a QR code embedded or printed onto the stickers, which means that people can scan and go to the translated webpage too. There's just another point I'd just like to add is that when an address does get a red sticker and we know it is a tenanted address, then the landlord does actually get a letter advising of the situation and encouraging them to look at their refuse arrangements and consider upsizing if it's an issue.
Thank you. Councillor Brown?
Yeah, the issue, even around the 3 strikes, I start to feel funny about the language around it. This has come to play when they first rolled out the bins, where I received, because I was involved in it, Wainui so many phone calls from rentals, big families, tiny bin. And I think this has just come to play. That's why I asked you what regions is this in. And there are big families, and the more hardship they're in, the more amount of families are living in the one house. So I don't think we can just sort of aim it straight at they're choosing not to, they're making bad decisions. That's a survival mode for some. So yeah, I think there's going to have to be a couple of ways of looking at it, not just the 3 strikes and you're out, when it's families that are, you know, some families in Nainai have got 3 to 4 families living in the one property and they've got the tiny wee bin. So there's layers of approach. So can you look at different options and get rid of the framing around 3 strikes? I really starting to get allergic to that.
Look at the language that is used and just making sure we've got the right package to deal with situations like that. And the survey did bring that to the front. So there was a slightly higher proportion of people that were renting that also said that their bin is too small. So that it does play out in the data, not just anecdotal evidence. And it's something that we suspect that is happening. So.
Great. Mayor Barry?
I think the point's a good one around empathy of working with people and different situations with, of course, understanding that in some cases you will need to come down quite firm. But I think Councillor Brown's point around that empathy, particularly as we continue to have these challenges with overcrowded homes and what that may mean. So, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to close off questions there. Different topic, but same paper. Councillor Mitchell.
Thank you. I did forewarn you earlier, but yeah, I had a question about the litter monitoring, and really great to see the collaboration with Sustainable Coastline so we can actually see some data on all of this. And the standout volume of litter at the west end of Petone Beach was astonishing, like way higher than elsewhere in the harbour, way higher than a national average. And I'm curious, there was a little bit of mention in there, but curious of whether it's suspected that that's because we have a big littering problem in that more urbanised end of Petone, or is it because of the geography of things? It's opposite, you know, furthest from the mouth of the harbour, so there's tides coming in. It's near, you know. Do we have any idea whether we have a severe littering problem down there, or whether there's other factors at play?
So my discussions with Sustainable Coastlines have led me to believe that around 80% of the litter that is found on Petone Beach and sort of similar beaches around Lower Hutt is derived from elsewhere, from Upper Hutt and Wellington, and that have been transported through our waterways, our stormwater networks, and then deposited at the beach. So I don't think it's people littering, people at the beach, beachgoers littering per se. I just think it's kind of like a conduit for litter from elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Now going to the recommendations, particularly noting recommendation 1, approves the delegation of the Wellington Region Waste Management and Minimisation Plan consultation process to the Wellington Region Waste Management and Minimisation Plan Joint Committee in line with the special consultative procedures under the Local Government Act 2002, and also 2, a noting recommendation, all on page 167. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Deputy Mayor Lewis. Is there any debate? Councillor Brown.
Thank you for the report, and thank you for all your work. And this is a great conversation to have, because when there's no data at all, you can't have the conversation. So we're obviously able to talk a whole lot more than we were able to 3 years ago. So thank you for all of that. And it just allows us the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper. Like other areas in this just transition, as we are transitioning to a climate change focus, it's happening in all areas, not just this, but it's people who are struggling the most are the ones that are not benefiting the least, and it's skewing it a little bit. I'm all for bins getting removed if it's not working, because we can't come to a point where it just carries on. But at the same time, it's just looking at those different options, because I'm not surprised where the areas of problem is. 4 or 5 years ago, we would have been talking about, we can't do this because they just put dirty nappies everywhere and they don't. So this is not going to work. We've sort of evolved to being able to have these proper conversations about really what it is, the drivers behind these things. So yeah, I just thank you for the work that you've done, all of you.
Councillor Parkin.
Kia ora. Similar to Councillor Brown, I'd just like to reiterate the thanks for the work and the conversations that we're having. And similar to what Councillor Brown was talking about before, with making sure that we have the appropriate information getting to people in an appropriately addressed manner, I would like to remind ourselves that people who are struggling are often digitally illiterate or less literate from a digital perspective. So while QR codes are a nice solution, if you don't have access to a cheap internet service, you're less likely to use it. So physical paper and being able to engage through the community and potentially through our community engagement connected communities services may be an appropriate way to try and increase that form of education in ways that people can access. But again, thank you for the work.
Just a final comment from myself. Thank you for this whole report, and particularly I want to touch on the food and green waste options in the business case coming next cycle. It's been obviously talked about before we even did the curbside rollout around how do we deal with food waste in our city. So the work that's being progressed is looking great, and looking forward to discussing it in a couple of months' time with you all. As per the contamination issues has been questioned and talked about already, yeah, I do agree with Councillor Brown and the Mayor around the empathy and taking into account the situation that's truly occurring for each household. And if people are intentionally just putting all of their refuge waste into the recycling bin and no care in the world about it, well then definitely they should be removed. But when it's people in hardship and struggling and doing their best to get by, as well as not having full education or understanding as well, as many of us do struggle as households to truly grasp what it means to recycle fully and appropriately. But so thank you for taking on board that approach and providing a lot of information and data for us to truly have these conversations, as Councillor Brown said. I think we're in a really good space in our trajectory as a city with waste minimisation. A lot of it's coming down to our collective work, so thank you. I'm now going to put both recommendations on page 167. All in favour say aye. I declare that carried. Moving on now to the update on climate change work. You're still in the hot seat today, so stay there and your team may wish to stay alongside you as well. We're now going to pass it over to you if there's anything additional to add. Otherwise, we'll take the report as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of updates, we have effectively completed the EV charging project. I'm informed that one of the units at Wainyamata is not working yet because the transformer hadn't been turned on, but we're getting there. So basically, I would expect that within the next week or two, the system will be up and running as it should be. And it is quite timely because you would have seen the draft charging strategy that the government has brought out. And I've commented on the report about that we aligned quite well with the target range of EV charging stations versus vehicles. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ian. Questions from members? It's a very full report of a lot of great work that's already occurring. No questions? Fantastic. Well, as well as highlighting the work around the EV chargers, I want to also acknowledge the work to decarbonise our vehicle fleet here in Council before we go into debate. And yeah, 50% of our vehicles being now electric is fantastic and continuing to grow every month as well. And so I'm now going to put the recommendations that we note and receive the update on page 183. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Parkin. Any other comments or debate? Deputy Mayor Lewis.
I was just pleased to see in the last part, the Adapting to Climate Change report's going to be finally finished, and hopefully the regional one I see there coming through for 2024, was it? And that will be good. The Harbour Ward is looking forward to something like that. Thank you.
I'll just say briefly in response to that as well, Deputy Mayor, that as well as the regional work being done, the intention is to have our city kind of go down to a bit more granular level around how we will be adapting. But again, it's a very long-term piece of work that officers will be undertaking once we've got that regional strategic view as well. Any final comment? I'll put the recommendation. Oh, was that Mayor Barry? No. I'll put the recommendations. All in favour say aye. I declare that carried. We're now moving on to the Ford program. Pretty self-explanatory. Any questions before I put the recommendation? Councillor Mitchell.
Yeah, I just had a question about the reports on Te Ara Whakamua and the work being done there. And in this work program, there's nothing scheduled for the remainder of this calendar year. I kind of feel like it would be good to get a regular update on that one, on what that group is doing, a couple of times a year at least. So I'm just wondering if that could be brought forward or programmed as a regular.
Yes, I'll respond to that, and then you may have a bit more to add. So at the most recent meeting, it was discussed, and it was actually more of a bit of a reset meeting around the way that the group's going to operate and what they're going to be taking care of in the next calendar year. I did pass on the invitation from this committee to have regular updates and to come and speak as well. So the members are aware of that. It's in there as pending because we want to give them lead-in time to which committee works for them. But when that group is willing and ready to come and present, then that will definitely be on the agenda. Anything else you want to add to that, Ewan, before I go to Deputy Mayor Lewis? That cover it, Deputy Mayor Lewis?
Thank you. I also note above that is the Sponge Cities update. And I just wondered, in conjunction with, how's that working with the district plan and the work that I assume that would come from something like Sponge Cities?
And so I'll start on it and then pass it over to you. So I've had conversations with both Alison Geddes and Andrea Blakeshaw and Ewan around the Ford program, both for this calendar year, but going into next, and kind of getting that right balance of workload for the officers, but also expectations being met by committee. So there are more items as well that aren't on this forward program, but they will be in the next. Unfortunately, Alison wasn't available this week to get that fully typed up for today's meeting. With the sponge cities, my conversation around it is that there will be work done, but how that comes and what that looks like, yet to be determined. Alison did point out that sponge cities isn't a new concept. It's just being talked about a lot more recently post flooding and cyclone events as well. But it is in consideration of officers' work. But again, how that materialises is yet to be determined. Ewan or Andrew, anything else to add?
Maybe just briefly, and you've already alluded to this, that the current district plan does have, it doesn't talk about sponge cities because that's just a more recent term perhaps, but it talks about avoiding the sealing of surfaces in that context. And my understanding is that the district plan team is very much cognizant of the need for more of that. And that could be things like silk pits, rain gardens, avoiding the sealing of surfaces or having retention tanks to cater for, especially if there are a lot of sealed surfaces. So the district plan, and my understanding is this will come to the district plan committee. It's very much part of the work program to look at provisions around this.
Deputy Mayor Lawes?
And I also just assume that it will be pulling out of the whaitua work as well, because a lot of that was on that subject.
So had a similar conversation around the whaitua work and reporting, and there will be some information coming to this committee. But if you have any more detailed questions about the district plan, best to put them to Councillor Dyer, and he'll be able to give you a bit more steer on expectations and timeframes. So I'm going to put the recommendation. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Edwards. All in favour say aye. Declare that carried. I've received no questions, but before we go to closing karakia, I just want to make a brief acknowledgement of Helen Oram, who's sitting with us today. If you don't know already, Helen has put in her resignation as the Director for Environment and Sustainability here at Council. She's done a lot for this council in the city over the last 18 years in many roles. It was actually integral in setting up and establishing this committee. So we collectively thank you, Helen, for your work, your dedication, and your passion for the environment. So thank you very much. Now going to ask Judy to put up the closing karakia. Please all do join in as we close off today's meeting. Me noi tātou, unuhia, unuhia, unuhia I te urutapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairoa I te arataka tū, koia rā e runga, whakahiria ake ki runga, kia wātea, aira ko wātea, hau pai marere. I declare the meeting closed at 3:08. Thank you, everybody.